Cynical me thought it was, yeah, this girl, he's a little bit sweet on her, you know what I mean? Like you would.
Jeff Beck was known for speaking his mind without trying to make people comfortable. Unlike many other guitarists who were careful about what they said to the press, Beck simply told the truth about what he thought. His opinions were often harsh, but they came from a genuine place. He dedicated 6 decades of his life to finding the perfect sound and the perfect musical feeling that could not be manufactured or faked. When he saw other musicians cutting corners or making music just for money, it frustrated him deeply. Beck was not being cruel when he criticized other artists. He was being honest, and there is an important difference between the two. He had spent years mastering his instrument through intense dedication and experimentation. Every sound he created was deliberate and earned through countless hours of practice and exploration. Watching other musicians rely on hype or hide behind studio production really bothered him. His criticism did not come from jealousy, it came from disappointment, the kind of feeling you get when something you care about deeply gets treated cheaply. There were 7 specific albums that Beck particularly disliked. These records represented everything he thought was wrong with rock music, including phoniness, laziness, and the prioritization of marketing over actual musical skill. Some of these albums were huge commercial successes. Others received praise from critics. Beck did not care about any of that. He could hear past all the noise and recognize what was really there, or more importantly, what was missing. The first album on his list was Slippery When Wet by Bon Jovi. This record sold more than 28 million copies around the world, but Beck thought every single copy was worthless. When the album came out in 1986, it turned Bon Jovi into massive stadium-filling stars. Songs like Livin' on a Prayer became anthems that everyone sang along to. You Give Love a Bad Name dominated music television. Wanted Dead or Alive made the band's lead singer look like some kind of poetic cowboy figure. American audiences loved it. Beck wanted nothing to do with it. His problem was not that the album was popular. Beck had nothing against musicians finding success. The issue was how calculated everything sounded. Every musical note seemed like it had been tested with focus groups. Every chorus was designed specifically to get crowds singing along. The guitar playing was competent enough, but it never took any risks. The guitarist played exactly what each song needed and nothing more. For Beck, who treated his guitar like it was having an actual conversation, this approach to music was completely dead. Slippery When Wet represented the moment when rock music stopped being an art form and became just another product to sell. During the 1980s, guitars became accessories for commercials selling hairspray. Bands were not asking themselves what they wanted to express artistically. Instead, they were asking what would sell the most copies. Every song on the album sounded like it had been designed backwards from a marketing strategy. The creators seemed to be asking what teenagers wanted to hear, what would get played on the radio, and what would look good in a music video. When Beck played music, he looked for happy accidents that created magic. He valued wrong notes that somehow felt more right than the technically correct ones. He appreciated feedback that sounded like singing instead of just noise. Real music existed in that space between perfection and chaos. Bon Jovi eliminated all of that uncertainty and creativity. They wanted rock music that was safe for radio, ready for arenas, and good for selling merchandise. Beck wanted honesty and truth. The two approaches could not have been more different from each other. The second album Beck disliked was 1984 by Van Halen. Beck never denied that Eddie Van Halen could really play guitar. The man had technical ability that made other guitarists feel like quitting out of frustration. However, the 1984 album was where Beck felt Eddie's actual talent got buried underneath synthesizers and spectacle. The album opened with a song called Jump that featured keyboards instead of guitars. The biggest hit on a Van Halen record barely used Eddie's main instrument at all. Beck saw this as a surrender of what made the guitarist special. The album sold more than 10 million copies and made Van Halen even bigger stars than they already were. But to Beck, it showed a talented guitarist abandoning what made him unique. Eddie had revolutionized rock guitar with his two-handed tapping technique. Now he was playing second fiddle to a synthesizer. Other songs like Panama and Hot for Teacher brought the guitar back into focus, but Beck felt the damage was already done. His issue was not with synthesizers in general. Beck had experimented with electronic sounds throughout his own career. His problem was watching Eddie use synthesizers as a crutch instead of as a creative tool. Jump worked because it was catchy, not because it was musically brave. It was the sound of a virtuoso playing it safe just to achieve commercial glory. What really bothered Beck was the guitar hero worship that followed. Suddenly, every young person with a guitar was learning tapping techniques and turning them into party tricks instead of real musical expression. Eddie's innovations became gimmicks when lesser players copied them. The focus shifted from feeling and emotion to flash and showing off, from communication to competition. Van Halen proved that you could be incredibly talented and still make choices Beck hated. It was skill without soul and technique without any real purpose. The album turned guitar playing into athletics instead of art. The third album was The Wall from Pink Floyd from 1979. This double album was praised as a masterpiece by many people. Roger Waters put his psychological struggles into 26 tracks, exploring isolation, fascism, and mental breakdown. Critics called it ambitious, important, and groundbreaking. Jeff Beck called it unbearably pretentious. The Wall was not just an album to listen to, it was like homework. You had to study it, decode it, and sit through all the metaphors and concepts and messages being hammered into your head for 80 minutes. Beck had no patience for this approach. Music that required a manual to understand was not really music in his view. It was theater pretending to be something deeper than it actually was. Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 became a huge hit, but even that song felt calculated to Beck. It featured a children's choir singing about education over a disco beat underneath social commentary. It worked commercially, but Beck heard the manipulation in it. The song was not organic. It was constructed to make a specific point and sell records at the same time. What made Beck most angry was how the guitar disappeared under layers and layers of production. David Gilmour was a brilliant guitar player, but The Wall suffocated his instrument under synthesizers, sound effects, and conceptual weight. Comfortably Numb had that famous guitar solo, but you had to wade through so much self-important build-up to reach it. Beck believed music should hit you immediately, not 3 songs into the album after you figured out the narrative storyline.
The Wall demanded your complete attention and total submission to Waters' vision. Beck thought that was arrogant. Good music does not require listeners to work that hard. It just works naturally. The fourth album was Journeyman by Eric Clapton. This one was personal for Beck. Clapton and Beck had come up together in London's blues scene. They had pushed each other, challenged each other, and respected each other's dedication to their craft. Then Journeyman came out in 1989, and Beck watched his old friend and rival give up. The album was not terrible, which was almost worse. It was competent and professional, but completely uninspired. Clapton played like he was just going through the motions, hitting his marks without ever really showing up emotionally. Bad Love had radio-friendly polish, but no real substance. Before You Accuse Me was a blues cover that added nothing new to the original song. The entire record felt like Clapton was just collecting a paycheck. Beck could not understand it. Here was one of the greatest blues guitarists alive playing beneath his actual ability because the music was safe. There were no risks and no chances of failure, just smooth, adult contemporary rock that would not offend anyone or challenge anything. Clapton had gotten comfortable, and comfort was the enemy of great art in Beck's view. What made Beck angriest was all the wasted potential. Clapton could still play brilliantly when he wanted to, but Journeyman proved he did not want to anymore. He had found a formula that worked commercially and decided to stop pushing himself. For Beck, who constantly reinvented his own sound, this was unforgivable. The production was too clean and expensive sounding, but sterile. Clapton's guitar tone, which had once been raw and powerful, now sounded like it had been tested with focus groups. All the rough edges were smoothed away. The danger was removed. What remained was pleasant background music for people who had stopped really listening to music. The fifth album was Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols. Punk rock arrived in 1977, declaring that musicianship was irrelevant. The Sex Pistols could not really play their instruments well. They admitted it openly. They even celebrated their lack of technical skill. Nevermind the Bollocks sold that incompetence as authenticity, and an entire generation bought into it. Jeff Beck, who had spent his entire life mastering his craft, found this insulting. Anarchy in the UK crashed through 3 chords like they were the only 3 chords that existed. God Save the Queen snarled with attitude, but had almost zero musical sophistication. Pretty Vacant lived up to its name. The album's raw energy was undeniable, but so was its fundamental lack of skill. Beck was not some snob who thought you needed formal conservatory training to make good music. He loved raw blues players who had never read a single musical note. But those players had feeling and instinct and something to communicate through their instruments. The Sex Pistols just had rage and publicity. They made a virtue out of not bothering to learn their instruments properly. What bothered Beck most was the influence this had. Suddenly, thousands of young people picked up guitars and formed bands without learning how to play first. Punk rock said that was fine, that passion mattered more than ability. Beck thought that attitude was just lazy. Passion and skill were not enemies of each other. The best music came from having both qualities together. The sixth album was Foolish Behavior by Rod Stewart. Rod Stewart had been Jeff Beck's singer at one point. Together, they had made some of the rawest and most powerful rock music of the late 1960s. Then Rod found solo success and slowly started chasing trends instead of making authentic music. By the time Foolish Behavior came out in 1980, he had completely abandoned everything they had built together. The album chased disco trends and pop trends and whatever was selling that particular week. Passion was drenched in synthesizers and string sections. Tonight's the Night might have been romantic, but it was also calculated for maximum radio play. Rod had gone from being a genuine blues shouter to a guy making music for dentist office waiting rooms. The voice was still there, but the spirit had left. Rod sang these songs like he was reading a grocery list, professionally adequate but dead inside. What killed Beck was knowing what Rod was actually capable of creating. Truth, their first album together, was raw and dangerous. Rod's voice could communicate pain, joy, desire, and everything that made rock and roll matter. Foolish Behavior proved he had traded all of that for easy money and soft rock radio play. Beck had turned down reunion offers with Rod multiple times. This album showed him he had made the right choice. They no longer spoke the same musical language. Rod had learned to speak corporate language. Beck still only spoke the truth. The distance between them was now permanent and enormous. The album Jeff Beck hated most was actually his own work. There and Back was released in 1980 and was supposed to follow up the fusion success of his earlier albums. Instead, it became the record that haunted him for decades afterward. Every time someone praised it, Beck would wince. They were hearing something he simply could not hear. All he heard were the compromises he had made. The record label wanted another commercial winner. They pushed for tighter songs, cleaner production, and less experimentation. Beck gave in more than he wanted to admit to himself. Some songs were solid, but they played it safer than his instincts demanded. The album sold well. Critics were kind to it. None of that mattered to Beck. He knew exactly where he had compromised his vision and where he had let time pressure and commercial expectations push him away from what he really wanted to create. You can please the record label and please the fans and still know deep in your gut that you failed yourself. There and Back taught Beck a lesson he never forgot. Never again would he release something he didn't believe in completely. His later albums took longer to make and sold less, but they represented his actual artistic vision. He would rather put out nothing at all than put out something mediocre with his name attached to it. Jeff Beck's hatred for these albums came from a place of deep love for music. He despised these records because he cared too much about music to accept mediocrity in any form. Every record he criticized revealed what he truly valued as an artist. He valued honesty over hype, risk over safety, and soul over sales figures. His anger was never petty or mean-spirited. It was the fury of a master craftsman watching his art form get cheapened and degraded. Sometimes the music you hate defined you just as much as the music you love. Beck's criticism showed exactly what kind of artist he was and what principles he refused to compromise throughout his entire career.